All right, and we are live. Okay. So welcome everyone to our broadcast this evening. We are celebrating Social Work Month with all of our lovely social work ladies that we have here today. And so, what we're going to do to get started is just have everyone go around. We'll do that clockwise again and introduce themselves. So, if you could just tell everybody your name, where you're located, also get some information about where you completed your education, and then just anything else you feel will be pertinent to kind of introduce yourself to everyone this evening. So we want to start with Lula.
Sure. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lula Haley. I am a licensed clinical social worker out of Atlanta, Georgia. I have a master's degree in social work from Clark Atlanta University here in Atlanta. I have spent the majority of my years post MSW in the clinical setting in hospitals, working in inpatient medicine as well as mental health. And currently, I am an administrator or administrative director over a veterans crisis line, one location of our veterans crisis line here in Atlanta. So a lot of my work has been also very veteran centric. I've been with the VA now almost 10 years in different capacities. And so that is that's me in a nutshell.
Hello, so my name is Gabby. I am currently located in Denver, Colorado. I moved here about a year and a half ago. I am from Indiana originally, so I went to Indiana University Bloomington from undergrad for social work, and then I did my master's at IUPUI, which is Indiana University at the Indianapolis location. I graduated in 2015, but my career didn't start till later. At first, I was in the Peace Corps, and then when I returned, I started my social work clinical journey. So I am a school-based therapist for a community mental health center here in Aurora, Colorado. So I work with elementary schools, and then I also have a kindergarten through 8th grade. So that's my position at this time.
Thank you, ma'am.
Good afternoon, everyone. And again, thank you so much, Dr. Dooley, for this opportunity to share this platform about what social work is and what it isn't. My name is Shanika Pope. I am a licensed clinical social worker. I am currently in Dayton, Ohio. I am originally from Indianapolis, Indiana. So my undergrad degree is actually psychology, but I earned my MSW at IU School of Social Work in Indianapolis. I graduated in 2002. And so for a better 20 plus years, I've kind of worked in mental health. So I started off as a school-based therapist for a community mental health agency. I did crisis work for that community mental health agency as well. So did that for about 10 years. And then I switched over and became a school social worker for Indianapolis Public Schools. Served 10 years as well. So elementary, middle, high school. And then I moved to Dayton, Ohio in 2014 and served as a director of director of a long-term care facility for 2 years. So giving me kind of experience across the lifespan. And then I served as director of guardianship for a probate court, working with individuals 18 and over who've been deemed incompetent for many reasons. I also, I'm an adjunct instructor, so I teach associate's level, bachelor's level, master's level social work students. I love that part of my job. And currently, I work on the prevention side. So I spent 20 something years on the treatment side. So I am kind of dipping my toe in kind of macro work, so working with grants that support providers for mental health services here in Dayton, Ohio. I'm also a certified mediator, and I'll love to talk about that a little bit later on, but just a snippet of what social work can, fit into, different spaces and different settings.
Thank you. And I think that is a great overview, just like from this start of the conversation and how varied your careers and your experiences have been. So I figured there's like some kind of like basic questions I thought we could kind of just address at the beginning. So one of those questions was just about like the basics of getting your training and your clinical hours. And so how, I guess what the question is, how did you get your hours? I guess it's about 3,000 hours. That was what the question said. I'm assuming that's correct. Okay, y'all say yes. So how did you get your clinical hours? How did, what means did you get them? And like, how challenging was it for you to get those? So again, if everybody could kind of let us know how that process worked for them.
Sure. So it can be very difficult. I've heard lots of stories of fellow colleagues trying to get their clinical hours and the difficulties they face. I was very lucky because when I came out of graduate school, I went right into the clinical space. I worked in hospitals where I worked in a community hospital in an oncology clinic for the first year while I studied for my generalist level clinical license, and then transitioned over to the VA where I worked under a social worker while I got my clinical hours. So it was really beneficial because I was able to get that clock hours as I was working. And then we allotted time to do individual supervision. So I think it's like 3,000 has been a while now. So I think it's 3,000 hours of clinical. And then you also need 120 hours of supervision under an LCSW who has had their license for 2 or more years. So lots of stipulations, but I was able to get all of mine during, as a part of my employment. So by the time I was at the VA at about my 3rd year, I received the hours and the licensure and was able to sit for the hours and the supervision, and was able to sit for the licensure exam.
Yeah, so I had a very similar experience. I'm actually in the process right now. And actually in Colorado, you need more than 3,000 hours. So it does depend on your state. So mine's 3,300, I believe. But I will still be able to use the hours in Indiana towards my licensure, which is good. I actually just passed my exam. So yeah, very exciting. The exam can be kind of stressful. So yeah, similar experience. I got my supervision hours through my first community mental health job as a school-based therapist. And so if you're unlicensed, you meet with your supervisor once a week. When I moved out here, I really fell in love with play therapy. And so I actually paid an outside supervisor for synergetic play therapy. So that's also another option or route. It's a bit more expensive. So, but that was also super helpful. That's been my experience.
So when I worked back in the 90s, and there wasn't a huge push to get your license. And so because I worked under a licensed clinical social worker, she signed off, on my progress notes and treatment plans. And we staffed with a psychiatrist, who was kind of in-house for us. And it wasn't until I moved over to be a school social worker. And so I received my LSW, but I had my clinical hours by way of employment-based supervision. We had group supervision, so we met weekly. We met bi-monthly for group. And so I actually had my hours 3 years post MSW, but I just wasn't in a space to pursue my clinical license. And so I guess I saw fit to kind of pursue that here recently. And so that's my clinical license experience. But initially, so the late 90s, if you had an in-house clinical supervisor, you were pretty much okay. And it wasn't until years later that, most employers are seeking, whether it's an LSW, so a licensed social worker, whether it's a bachelor's level or master's level, but it's the clinical spaces that either want you license eligible or want you to have your clinical license. And in Ohio, we have a licensed independent social worker, so LISW, and that gives you a little bit more freedom here, in Ohio. So I'm in the process of reciprocity. So my clinical license is in Indiana, and each board, so Gabby, you brought out a really good, point. Each board is different, and you would think that there would be just a streamline of reciprocity. Every state has different requirements, but they all want you to have that MSW, so you would think that, all states would be online and that standard would be universal, but it is not.
And if I could piggyback on what you mentioned, Shanika. So I would say, I came out of my MSW program in 2010, and there was very much the shift in the years after towards LCSW, and it being, I worked in an agency that it was required for specific positions. And I noticed that a lot of colleagues that I've had who had been in the field for a long time hadn't, because there wasn't so much of a push. But in these most recent years, it's almost like as soon as you come out of school, you start prepping for licensure, because it's just become such an important thing in our field. And when you start looking at specific sets of employment, it's often required more than it is just, something to have. So a lot of, I think, decision making for me around which jobs I pursued and things like that were based in that. Where would I be able to get my clinical hours? Like Gabby mentioned, having to pay someone for hours outside of a work setting or supervision outside of a work setting can get expensive. And so it really is everything, all the decisions I made, a lot of it was with that clinical focus or that clinical licensure in mind, because it almost felt like it was very necessary to be able to advance in the career.
And I'll say one last thing. There was a point in time, so I appreciate, just the emphasis on the licensure process, because, this field, we have some outstanding professionals. And prior, so I want to say in the 80s, you have individuals that were grandfathered in without the schooling. So you have a set of LSWs, so they're not able to become clinical social workers, but they are LSWs without the schooling, without the degree. So I am thankful, although, I wish kind of the standards were more universal. I can appreciate just that push to make sure everything is decent in order as you apply for that license.
And that kind of really brings us into the next question that I got. And that's basically a person who they described the degree as a human services degree. And again, I'm not sure how much overlap education wise that is, social work wise, but basically a person who with a human services degree who has been looking for jobs as a case manager. And the question again, she described looking for a social work job. And I wonder so I guess what I'm taking from the question is, if you have a bachelor's level, I'm assuming human services, or maybe at the social work level bachelor's, the question was like, what kind of careers or employment could you expect to have at that level with those kind of parts of education?
So some of my experience around that was I did find it difficult to find employment with just my bachelor's degree. And I got my bachelor's degree in psychology with a minor in sociology. So my bachelor's degree was not in social work. But I knew that was what I wanted to pursue. But I also didn't want to go immediately into graduate school. I wanted to at least work for like a year and maybe, start saving some money for graduate school costs. So I ended up getting a job with the Department of Human Resources here and Department of Family and Children's Service as the under agency to do case management work. At the time in Georgia, you had to have a bachelor's degree. It didn't specify what field it was in. But there were a few counties in the metro Atlanta area that were under some different mandates, and you had to have your bachelor's degree in social work or have a bachelor's degree in another area, but have had 1 year of experience to work in those counties. So actually my first job out of graduate school, I took it in a rural county, which is about an hour outside of Atlanta, in order to get that experience. And I worked there for about 1.5 years and then transferred in to the county where I lived in. So it's, there definitely, the honest answer is that there's minimal opportunities in the social work field without having the master's degree. It's almost this kind of like that is the basic requirement for a social work position is the MSW. But in human services, child welfare agencies like that is a good way to get some experience in a generalized field and understand if you want to pursue from there, then likely you'll need to pursue the master's level education.
So like you, Lula, my undergrad degree is psychology. So my very first job was a case manager. So I was a school-based case manager for that community mental health agency. My, options as far as what I could do in that role were very limited. So it was more skill building. I didn't have the access to the healing part, to the therapy part. That was for the therapist that I was paired with, but did a lot of community linkages and outreach and, so on and so forth. But many, like bachelor's level kind of jobs in child welfare or other like nonprofit settings will kind of have opportunities for whether it's human service, whether it's psychology, whether it's sociology. You would see kind of entry level positions, but as you kind of get more specified, that is when many organizations or entities require a minimum of an MSW. And so you can't call yourself a social worker with a human services degree. You have to either have that BSW or an MSW, but you can do social service work, human service work, or casework, with a non-social work degree.
Thank y'all for clarifying that, because the question came to me and I was like, honestly, I don't know. I was like, I don't think you can say you're a social worker without actually having a social work degree. But I was like, let me ask. Gabby, I don't know if you have anything to add to that, or is that pretty much kind of the same the experience you've had too?
Yeah, I was going to say, most of it, my experience is what I've seen is case management sort of work, like homeless services, child welfare, crisis centers. That's, sort of where I've seen the bachelor level work as well.
And then kind of, again, moving into some of these kind of just like, let's just get them out of the way questions. So there is kind of the belief that social work is not very like financially lucrative. I definitely think that social workers are underpaid for the work that they do, like period. And so at least in my experience, there's a lot of work that social workers do and their compensation is not equal to that. But I guess just in your experience, and I don't necessarily know if the person was asking for specific numbers, but I guess what is your kind of view on like the financial, I guess, stability of social work and financial like advancement piece as it relates to social work and your experiences?
So I think that often there's this perception that if you pursue education in social work, then you're very limited to what type of field you can work in. So many times when I've had conversations with people and they ask me what I do and I say I'm a social worker, they're like, oh, so you work in child welfare. Like there's this small subset that people think is all you can do in social work. And I think the biggest answer I would have for that question is that it really depends. It depends on what you go into. You can use your social work skills and your social work degree to springboard you into so many different types of fields, and some of them can be very lucrative. I think when you think about child welfare, those type of agencies, often they are not. Those are, many of us will say we went through that as an entry-level person to get some experience and hopes that we could pursue from there. My experience on the clinical side, I would say that I did specifically pursue, federal employment because for some of the very reasons, like with social work, it felt like social work was very valued in the federal arena, and that when I worked in the medical center, we had a social work service line of almost 400 social workers. We had programs that were social work led. So you weren't just, working maybe on an inpatient unit or something like that. You would be running a program. You were, you may be a deputy or assistant chief or a chief of a service line with a social work degree. So there were so many opportunities for advancement that I found under the federal umbrella. And even in my current role right now, I'm not even really doing clinical work. I'm 100% administrative. I manage people more than I do cases. So, if you choose to pursue the management, role, there's ways to do that as well with a social work degree. So I think that people think social work degree, you're only limited to doing direct patient care. And that may be how you start, but it can open the door for so many other things for you. And many of those can be careers that are that can be very lucrative.
Gabby, you have any comments about that?
I would agree. I think like what she was talking about, you do usually see better like benefits or pay in the federal area, like for the VA or, but I knew kind of going into it, because that is one of the first comments you get, like, you're not going to get paid a lot, or, oh, you're, like you have such a heart, there's just all these kind of ideas about it, or child welfare. I definitely didn't go into it thinking that I was going to be making a lot of money. And I just really enjoy the community mental health population, which is mostly Medicaid driven. And so, there isn't a lot of money making in that area. I think eventually private practice is something that I will be interested in. So I know that's a way to have more kind of control over the services and the pay that you're going to get. So that's been sort of my experience.
So just to add to what Lula and Gabby have already said, there are arenas where the entry level pay is very minimum. But what's kind of important to kind of discuss here is it's marketable. What you do with your degree is up to you. So if you are pursuing different certifications, if you're kind of pursuing those things that can make you able to kind of write your own way, that's pretty important too. I do a lot of contract work. Dr. Dooley, when I met you, I had a full-time job, but I did PR and work in crisis to kind of give me clinical experience, to give me just more tools in my tool belt. I teach. I do a lot of community teachings in the area here in Dayton. So while sometimes, yes, that entry level position may not, equal fair pay, I'll say that. But as you gain experience, as you gain knowledge, you're able to kind of present yourself and you can negotiate your rate. You don't have to accept, what people offer, and what you bring to the table opens the door for you to kind of write your own check, so to speak. So I think that's a myth. Certainly, you have social workers who are doing many things in many spaces, earning a great wage.
And that kind of brings me, Shanika, right kind of into my next question. And that is one of the things I admire about social work as a profession is that it's a very woman driven profession. And that I think there is something about the nature of that where social work builds great leaders and they build great women leaders a lot, because it's a majority women profession. And so I guess, what do you think? Because I've wondered this, because I feel like in medicine, they do not do as good of a job specifically focused on women to build women leaders. And in fact, if you have a child or you need some time for family, I feel like it's really kind of negatively viewed on, and you're kind of expected to sacrifice, yourself.
Yeah.
Whereas I feel like in social work, because it is so women led, like, okay, well, if my boss is the leader of this whole program is a woman and she has a family, like they make it work. I feel like in a way that I don't see in other professions. So what do y'all think that it is? Is it just like the women influence? What do you think builds that leadership skill? Even Shanika, you just mentioned negotiating. I think as women, that's something in general we don't do a good job of, but like you said, that right off the bat, you can negotiate. So what do y'all think it is that makes like such great leaders? What is it about social work?
So social work is a women heavy field. I love, so in many of my classes, I have, male social work students, and, I have encountered some, MSW social workers who are male, and I'm like, I'm loving that. But absolutely. So my very first clinical supervisor is my mentor to this day. She is still handling her business in Indianapolis. She's overseeing, a statewide agency and just really just doing phenomenal things. And so she really set that example for me. I did not really see myself being in direct care forever. And so my position prior to my new position, I was director over a whole program. And what was pretty cool, I worked at a court. And so there were no social workers in that space. So I was the first social worker and was promoted to director. So I was able to bring more social workers on board and students. So the court had never had an internship program. And so what I love about social work is that we have skills that transfer to any setting with any population. And I think that is pretty special, about what social work is. Now, when I first got to the court, some of the magistrates were like, what is this social worker doing here? And I told them one by one, I was turning them into social workers. But what they began to really understand was their Black robe nor their gavel would make family dynamics go away, will make mental illness go away. And so you will eventually run back, to participants who kind of had these challenges. And so, them able to see the social work perspective and value that, right before I left, one by one, the magistrates sat in my office and really kind of shared what it has meant to have a social worker on staff. And many of them have been there 20, years or more. and, you know, in the last 5 years had the experience with a social worker. So I hear them in the community telling agencies and organizations, you should hire a social worker. I'm like, yes, social workers for everyone, you know. And so for me, my mentor, you know, even in school, I had very strong social work professors who kind of sought me out for leadership opportunities. You know, I served as a field instructor for years. And it was because one of my female professors found me in a conference. It was like, I want you to do something. I'm like, no, I don't want to do anything. And she was like, yeah, you know, I want you to serve as field instructor. I'm like, I'm not ready. And she was like, yes, you are. You know, and so I think it's important for women, you know, to kind of reach back and provide that opportunity and mentor and give back to this field. That's kind of what makes this space special.
You know, one of the things you know, to build off of that. So I think what social work is, a helping professional at the core. It's a helping profession, right? So people who tend to be drawn to this field are people who are nurturers, right? We get into this field because we want to help people and we have a heart for service. And so when you have leaders who are, you know, for example, working under social workers who have supported me in that way, helped me understand, you know, the division between work and personal and taking time when you need it and understanding what you need for self-care and all of that. I felt like that is what has shaped me as a leader. I know how I have flourished under managers who've really given me, you know, the autonomy to use my clinical skills, or who have also encouraged me to make sure I'm not, you know, over, you know, giving of myself and being mindful about what I need and pushing me to take vacation and things like that. Those are skills that I feel like have made me so effective in once I transition into management roles. And I'm constantly, you know, checking in with my staff about what their needs are. And okay, I'm noticing that you may be a little burned out. How can I support you? Take time off. And it's just really a regurgitation of what was poured into me. So I think because of the skill set, or, you know, just the kind of inner qualities that many of us who who seek out this profession, it just gets nurtured. It's highly, like, it's very important in this field to kind of be good at self-care and be good at supporting and things like that. So I feel like it does kind of naturally translate into leadership skills. And I feel like some of the best leaders I have had are when I've reported to social workers, because they understand that balance. And I've always felt supported in giving my all at work, but then also taking what I need on the personal aspect, which in some professions, maybe in medicine, that's not the case, because there's a demand, but you know, all of us social workers are very clear on the fact that we can't support or pour into someone else if our cups are empty. And so we, you know, self-care, this is the one profession I think that we talk about self-care. Like, it's, you know, self-care now in the midst of a pandemic, it's kind of the hot button word. But for social work, I mean, I've heard that since day one, since graduate school. It was like, what do you do for self-care? And how do you make sure you are, you know, strengthening yourself so that you're better for your clients? And it's just been ingrained in us, I feel like, from day one.
Yeah, I think I would definitely agree with everyone is saying. And I think, and working in community mental health, I'm not going to deny that there are certain expectations. There's productivity that you are sort of expected to meet every month. And so part of the program manager's job is to, you know, address those administrative side things, like in supervision or otherwise. But even though there are those expectations, I feel like every manager who I've had who, you know, found those like really important and to like really push for you to meet those things. Also, like, there wasn't really any real consequences to not meeting those hours. You know, it was really like, how can I help you? How can I support you? You know, showing up to the school, being with me all day. Like, how am I organizing my time? Like that, I definitely like really appreciated. And yeah, I've appreciated these, like, seeing these women in like project or program director positions. You know, it is inspiring. And I've definitely learned a lot from those humans. And I think overall, like, you know, what you talked about earlier about kind of being like, we dip our toes in everything. We have like a very systematic approach to our work and humans. And so when you're dealing with humans, like, of course, there's going to be like, you might need to get some knowledge on law or medical field or health or whatever. Like, there's so much that is involved with our work. And so I think that's why people are kind of starting to notice the value that we do have in like mitigating barriers and risks and being very like strength focused and things like that. I think those are like foundational to social work. So that's why I love it.
Well, thank you for that, because I think that it's so obvious that the profession is able to really nurture people in that way, and I think that there's a lot of other professions, not just medicine, that could really learn a lot from that. Like, you don't build the best leader by like beating people down, like despite what the military might want to make people believe, you really don't, right? We like identifying people's strengths and nurturing them and helping to grow them is really how you're going to build a good stable leader. I'll leave it at that. Moving right into self-care, because that was also one of the other questions we got, which is, being at the interface of dealing with, the kind of the stress of dealing with mental health or substance abuse or just all these systems. I know the bureaucracy, in my opinion, can also be a stress. What do you do, and how do you manage your self-care, and how do you prioritize that?
So I think I had to learn the hard way about prioritizing self-care. Like Gabby mentioned, productivity, patient loads, things like that. Those things are always at the forefront. And as I saw my career advance and I became, program director or supervising, there were a lot more responsibilities. And so I found myself at a point where I felt like I kind of was throwing it all into work and not necessarily taking care of myself. So I had to kind of take a step back and say, okay, now we have to make sure we prioritize these things. And so since that time, I feel like I've done a better about balancing. No, even if it's just taking time to go outside for a walk or get a workout in, take time off. I used to think that time off was only if I was going somewhere, if I'm going to go on a trip, or if I'm doing this, but I realized like, no, it's actually beneficial to take time off, even if you have nothing to do, even if it's just a few days at home to just unwind and relax. And also just being in tune with myself, feeling when being like noticing when I'm getting overwhelmed or when things are really starting to take a toll, then saying, okay, now is the time that before it gets way out of hand, just take a moment, take a day, do something that makes you feel good. And so I think, that self-care can look very different for everyone. It's all in what makes you feel good and what makes you feel restored. And sometimes that's just, taking a day off to hang out with your family and not do anything. So
you are like the queen of the long weekend. You will take a 4-day weekend and make that into something. Like,
yes, I really would. With the federal government, we'd have, Columbus Day off. I'm like, okay, I'm going to take off the Monday, and Dr. Dooley like, well, what are you going to do? I may not do anything, but just to have that subset of days off, make me feel so much more refreshed and able to give my best when I come back to work.
Yeah, who's next?
I think one of the coolest things, so working with kids, like regulation is huge. So I'm learning a lot about that for myself, like regulate, managing, staying connected to myself. It's like just taking a deep breath when I need it. And so the cool part of my job is that I get to kind of regulate all day with kids, like breathe. And it's really helped me, right, like be more in touch with like, what am I feeling? How is my body feeling? All these sensations, like that is such a huge part, so that I can go home after, processing trauma or abuse and things of that nature, that I can be able to go home and separate myself and do what I need to do. And I think like with our team meetings once a month, we do a huge like connection circle sort of situation, or we do a wellness activity at the beginning of every team meeting for at least 5 minutes. So it's a huge part, and it's really important for us just because we're working with humans, and you're going to have these relationships and you're going to have these strong feelings, and things are going to come up for you. And so, it's really important to learn those regulation and mindfulness techniques.
So when I began my work, late 90s, trauma wasn't the buzzword. Secondary trauma, vicarious trauma really wasn't something that we talked about. And I had a very early experience, and I'm kind of grateful for that because it has been my saving grace with longevity in this field. So it was when I served as a case manager. There was a young man who his trauma story was just it hit me, and I didn't realize that it hit me, and I would come home and I was a different mother, I was a different person, and I did not realize that until it was brought to my attention. And so in that moment, I learned that it wasn't my job to save my clients, but it was my job to teach them skills to save themselves, and so that shift was my saving grace. And so, I appreciate boundaries, and there's a lot of conversation about what boundaries are, how do you make sure that happens for your clients, for your workspace, and all that. That becomes super important. And so early 90s, my first experience with vicarious trauma really set the stage to me to set boundaries, to find a way to kind of unpack or debrief. And then when I leave the office, I'm in the space to pick up my hat to be a mom or, to be a student or whatever that role is outside of my primary job. And so just understanding and Gabby, regulation, absolutely, being in touch, with your body. And self-care is a very personal kind of journey, and so it's not about, checking things off of your to-do list. It's about resetting and recentering and getting back into a space where you are, a great clinician, or you're a great mom, or you're a great you for you, because you're part of that equation too, and so supervision is another space I think is important. We kind of talked about that a little bit, but that's that space with you and your supervisor. And I share with my students, as you are interviewing, you need to talk about what you need for supervision, that advocacy space, that piece of advocacy. We do a great job of advocating for our clients, but we have to kind of do the same for us. And so knowing what your needs are and being able to articulate that, on an interview is so important, because you grow in that supervision space. You're vulnerable in that supervision space, and you have to kind of share what your needs are.
Thank you for sharing that. I think about the importance of supervision. And I think Gabby even mentioned earlier, it's like, even if you recognize that, hey, I have an interest that my current supervisor doesn't have, like being willing to invest in yourself and in your learning, like, okay, I'm going to invest in myself, even if I have to pay outside of it to like know when to do that. So I think that kind of mentioning that is like so important. You guys are all doing very different kinds of work. And so I'd like to hear a little bit about what has drawn you to your current work. And, what do you like about the current work that you're doing?
So I work in the suicide prevention space. It was always something that I had an interest in. I couldn't tie it to anything. It was just, I did part of my internship in graduate school in the suicide prevention program at the Atlanta VA. And I really enjoyed it. And so when I got, employed and worked there for a couple of years, and there was an opportunity for me to transition into that program, I did. And it just is, it can be difficult work, but it can be very rewarding work. And so I spent several years in that program doing crisis intervention work, doing case management for high-risk veterans, and then went into the program management piece. And I just feel like I learned so much in that space in those years. That was really the depth of me getting into the mental health side of things. I've done most of my work before that, inpatient medicine, case management, and working really closely with mental health teams. I just feel like I honed my skills a lot. I learned a lot, and I really felt like I grew a lot as a clinician as well as a leader. And so after doing that for about 5 years, I had an opportunity to come over into working for the Veterans Crisis Line, but as an assistant deputy director. So all of the clinical skills that I was using day in and day out, they're a little different now. I'm not doing direct patient care anymore, but I think that prepared me for this role. And now I manage people. I have oversight of about 400 employees, crisis intervention staff, supervisors, and up the chain. And so the work I did there, it's still the same mission, right? We're still talking to those most need and crisis, doing crisis intervention work every day. But my vantage point now is a little different. It's more on the operations. How do we make sure we're prepared to meet the need of that caller when they reach out to us? So when I say earlier, like social workers can do things that are so beyond the direct, patient care aspect, I just saw my career go to that place, and I never thought it. I never really had that as a career path in mind, but just the doors opened, the opportunities, and I was really invested in suicide prevention work, and now I'm able to do it from a different aspect. So I've learned so much now. I mean, data was always a part of what I did, but now it's on a whole entire level that's very different. Personnel issues, managing staff, managing disciplinary issues on an entire different level. I had a team of 9 or 10 in my old role, and now I have oversight of 400 people. So there's just so many things that are different, but it still boils down to the core of social work. It's still a helping professional, and I'm still trying to encourage my staff for professional development, for enhancing their clinical skills, or meeting the needs of this vulnerable population. So Dr. Dooley knows it's made a complete 180 from where I thought I would have been, but it's been so rewarding, and I've learned so much more than I ever thought I could.
Lula, that's so awesome.
I'm just so proud of where she is too. But yeah,
like 400 people. Okay. So yeah, I'm still, I feel like I'm still a baby therapist. So, I've been in the field for almost 3 years, and I love direct practice. Like I just, I've worked with adults, and I did hospice, and I've enjoyed it all, but kids are definitely where I want to be, and families. I think just growing up being the oldest of 4, just like personal experiences, you get to be so playful, and I think play therapy is just incredible. So yeah, I don't know. I just that was the first job I sort of got when I got back from Peace Corps, and I fell in love. I love the school-based system. Like you're an outpatient therapist, but you're located in a school, which is a little bit different, maybe a little bit more isolating from your peers, but I get to have like this relationship with like the people that are in these kids' lives, their teacher, the principal, the social worker, there's just so many things that I can do on a larger level, being in a school, and having influence to like advocate for a kid, make sure their needs are being met, helping teachers manage the stress of kids in the classroom and these like behaviors and moods that are challenging. So I love it. I love having those relationships. I love having an impact on a larger level. And I get to, it's more convenient for families too, who are working, I can pull them from class. I can see them when they're in crisis if need be. And I get to, witness maybe some things in person that I wouldn't have like an outpatient setting. So that's why I love school-based. Like I get to be there, like in the moment, seeing what's going on with these kids and what their needs are. And getting like insight from their teacher and from the social worker. So there's just all these different levels to being a school social worker. And I get to like walk around or go play outside with the kid. It's a lot more active, I think, than like sitting in like maybe an outpatient setting. I'm getting up, I'm grabbing kids, I'm talking to different people. I'm still doing case management, which I love doing. So yeah, I'm super happy where I'm at. And just trying to continue my education, getting, certified in play therapy and becoming a registered play therapist. And I just feel like there's so many opportunities for like continuing training and different like therapeutic like models and things that you can learn that help you grow as a clinician. So yeah, I think in the future I'd love to supervise. I think I love working with like new clinicians too, new therapists. And supporting them because it's tough. And I think there's a lot of like imposter syndrome, as like a therapist in your first few years, still feeling like you're not, doing the best you can or whatever. So I would love to play that role as well in the future. So yeah, that's where I'm at.
Cool. It's been nice to see you grow as a clinician too.
Thank you.
So, Gabby, you just took me back down memory lane when I was a school-based therapist because I loved everything that you talked about. And Lula, kudos to you, for what you're doing as well. So, initially, I did a lot of micro work. So, a lot of work with individuals and families and mezzo work with groups. But my previous job, I did a lot of macro work. And so just kind of program design, policy design. And what was pretty cool is I had kind of the authority, I'm gonna put that word out there, to see something that was wrong and design things that fit the need of our consumer base. And so adult guardians and those who have been appointed by the court to serve as guardians, there are certain kind of requirements that they had to kind of maintain. Education was one of those requirements. And so to me, I don't believe in like checking the boxes. So if we are saying you have to do this, I want to ensure, that is supporting you in your role, so I had the ability, to do a needs assessment, to ask my guardians, well, what information do you need? I can't take away the requirement, but I can make this time meaningful for you. I had the, pleasure of putting policies in place that supported, vulnerable individuals, a population who's seeing invisible to others, just in that space as a social worker, bringing things to my administrative judge, who totally signed off on everything. She gave me kind of free reign, and I was able to kind of put some things in place. Was able to start a support group for individuals. Some of the guardians were parents. And so for the first time, they had a space to say, I am kind of saddened by the fact that, my child may not ever have children or go to the prom, or just have that space to be vulnerable and transparent, and how that was just kind of uplifting and just kind of cool for other parents to kind of say, wow, yeah, I've never said this out loud, but this applies to me too. So it's just pretty cool to be in that space, to see and to have a vision and just really have the space to make things happen. I had a early experience in my role as director where it was my very first education class, and a lady came up to me, and she was deaf. She was hard of hearing, and she had someone there to kind of communicate, but she had contacted the court and was like, I need this accommodation, but that information never made it to me, right? And so, however, being the director, I had to assume, this epic failure, because she did her part, but the information didn't get to me. And so was able to kind of like problem solve and get things for her in that moment. But I went back that very night with my IT person and made our interactive portal to include accommodations. That was an epic fail, but that was a learning space, and I had never considered that, and as a manager, you don't know that you have to see all things. Things that you don't know are important, you have to kind of have that lens and that vision. And so given that kind of situation, I promised myself I would consider all things. I would think about all things so that I never had someone looking at me with a need who had done their part, but because of a gap in communication, they didn't have the services that they needed. So I appreciate, being a social worker, in that space to, to kind of think through and have vision and kind of see things problematically. So in my current role, it's prevention stuff. So it's more macro. So grants, I work for a local ADAMS board, so Alcohol, Drug Addiction, and Mental Health Services Board. And so we are the umbrella for prevention and intervention and treatment services for Montgomery County here in Ohio. So seeing things, we have a strong suicide prevention program. We just kind of coordinated something with Dayton Children's, which is one of our hospitals here. It's called Handle with Care. So if a young person comes into contact with EMT or fire, or the emergency room, a line goes out to the school, and it's like Handle with Care. They don't say what the business is, but it alerts the school, hey, this student interface with the system, handle with care. So surround them with support and necessary resources. And so it's just pretty cool to kind of see things on a macro end, policy end, grant end. And so I think I've come full circle. Yeah.
Thank you for that. And that sounds like an amazing program to have that kind of connection between like emergency services and the school, because chances are if they came in contact with an EMT, I'm thinking just all the scenarios. Was there a parent who overdosed? Like, what are all the different things? Is there a medical issue that's not being addressed fully? Like, there's just so many places to pick up on that. So, in y'all's, it sounds like history, you guys all interface with like different systems and large systems. So, Shanika, it sounds like you're the county and the state and the courts, and Lula, you and the federal government. So, I definitely know with that. Those kind of bureaucracy and challenges are in Gabby with the school system. So I wonder if you could just speak to like in your systems or the systems you're navigating, like the challenges and what you have done to kind of overcome some of those systemic challenges. Because as we recognize, you can have good intentions, funding, and everything you need, but you run up into these barriers and like system challenges. So if you could just speak to like the system challenges in your kind of respective systems and how you've kind of got some workarounds in the systems.
Oh, the challenges. It can be very difficult. Speaking from the federal space, it's just where I've been for most of my career. Access was often one of the biggest challenges that we tried to manage. So in the VA system, the veterans who might fall into your catchment area, it's not like those of us who are civilians where, my doctor's office might be 5 minutes from my home. My local hospital might be 10 minutes away. We were dealing with veterans who were sometimes living hours away from where they got their care. And so that was always the biggest challenge for me in working, with our vulnerable veteran population, especially those who are, severely at risk from the mental health standpoint, it was just that they may not have had the resources. They may not have transportation. They may not have someone who can drive them, an hour and a half, 2 hours to come into this appointment. Thankfully over the years, we've expanded our virtual spaces and seeing people via telehealth and things like that. But that wasn't always the case just a few years ago. And so I often used to say that even though it felt challenging for us, there were so many more resources within the VA than in community hospitals. I worked in community hospitals. People would have transportation allowances. We might have physical transportation to pick people up and bring them to appointments. Those things would never have existed in the community hospitals that I spent some time at prior to coming to the VA. But even with those things, there were still some criteria. There were still criteria, and so the struggle is sometimes the lack of resources, or the lack your patient not having the eligibility for those resources. And, and you're talking to this patient who's really at need and you're like, I need you to come in and make this psychiatry appointment. And there's just all these barriers. And it can be difficult, and it can be very disheartening to feel like, there's just this one thing that's in the way. And, we used to always say, my social work team, like, we can't go pick people up from their house, but sometimes you feel like you want to, because you know that this person is really at need, but there's just this gap in care, and you try to figure out what community services might be there to fill in the gaps, and they're not always available. And we all know funding and certain time of year, no one has money. And so I think that's one of the biggest challenges I think as a social worker is dealing with these vulnerable populations, having the services that they need, but then there's just this big space in between, and how we get them there and how they can fully engage. Or sometimes we had veterans who say, I have to work in order to take care of my family. So you have appointments between 9 to 5. Well, that's when I work. So how do it was just always trying to use your brain, trying to be as creative as you can to figure out what you can put in place to get this, this person the care they need. And sometimes it didn't happen. And it's a frustrating situation to be in, and a heavy load to bear as the helping professional, to feel like I've failed this person, or I've not been able to connect them fully to care. It's just, it's difficult.
I was going to say, I feel like being in the VA system, at least my experience, is kind of like that do and apologize later. Like, I distinctly remember these transportation issues. We can't problem solve it. I totally got on my phone. I was like, we're going to call an Uber. We ain't going to ask nobody if it's okay. We're going to get an Uber. Yeah. They got to get to the appointment. Yeah. And then if somebody says so, we'll just apologize later. But you're right. It takes that sometimes. We have literally problem solve everything we have to do. And sometimes we just have to say, we're going to try to do the best thing for the patient. And then we're going to apologize later. So I definitely, at least in the federal system, know how stressful and frustrating it can be. Gabby, what would you say about the school system?
Well, I was just thinking about the transportation issue too, just with parents, and their work schedule, and trying to, time, I think time is for myself and, community mental health, you do have higher caseloads, and I would love to connect with families more. But I think, yeah, like getting to the school or getting to appointments, I mean, that can be a huge barrier, you know, whether transportation costs or they're working. Before my previous job, I was able to do some home-based work, but sometimes there's like a boundary there as well. So I think that's something I come across a lot too. And I think, you know, being in a school is like very unique. You know, and sometimes you sort of, again, like I talked about being involved sort of like in the mental health or behavioral health realm within a school. And like, sometimes, you know, sometimes how kids might be disciplined or things of that nature that you don't necessarily feel like is working, but due to like their own school's own need to collect data for themselves and for IEP or individual educational plans, things of that nature. There's some things that you have to sort of work around or slowly just try to have conversations about and advocate for the kid. But I feel like mental health in schools has definitely become more of a priority. You know, there's social emotional learning, there's like calm spaces, there's, in my Aurora public school system, they created like a fund basically for kids who can get free mental health, you know, therapy services without insurance or like, you know, Medicaid, you know, so they're covered. They also set up like a social worker at every school. So I think things have definitely been improving. And, you know, I have behavioral health meetings with my school's administration, like at least once a month with every school. So we can talk about how to meet these kids' needs or the teachers or, so I think that's been the really neat thing, is trying to find creative ways. I think we've talked about like being creative and thinking outside the box, and critical thinking, I think, are such huge skills that us social workers have in addressing barriers that do come up or challenges.
I was wondering if you could speak. I know you deal with a Spanish-speaking population, and yourself are bilingual. Can you just maybe speak to some of those like particular challenges with those kind of clientele that you see there?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. I definitely am fortunate that I am like Spanish speaking. I do have a lot of Spanish speaking families. And I think that also means like there's a different cultural component to working with those families as well. And a lot of my coworkers, you know, kind of struggle. I mean, using translations or services, you know, over the phone. It's a hard dynamic, and trying to connect and have relationships with these families. So I'm not sure. I think people do the best that they can. I think it definitely could be better. I think we could address like the more of the family system, especially for these Spanish speaking families. I think I have the unique opportunity to like do that and kind of understand a little bit of the cultural perspective. You know, my job we are doing a lot of work on just inclusion and equity. You know, we have meetings every month where we talk about like race and how it impacts us as therapists and our interactions with clients. And we, you know, challenge our own biases, and we've read like books, we listen to podcasts. Like it's one of my favorite things about my agency that we prioritize like that, because we are working. Aurora is like the most diverse city in Colorado. I think one of the biggest things is, you know, hiring more therapists that represent, you know, the kids that we are serving. And you can also see that with like teachers and things of that nature. So we talk a lot about like what that means, and especially working with kids of color and the, you know, school to prison pipeline and all these things and discipline. And so I think that's where we can be an advocate in our schools, like ourselves, educating ourselves and then sharing that information with the schools. So we've been working really hard on that, I think. And I really appreciate that.
That's awesome. That's really awesome. Mika, what about you? You're interfacing with a lot of different systems. So
what comes to mind, and I know we're kind of running out of time, it's just lack of trust in the system, you know? So in the court, it was protocol that if someone presented in a way that someone felt unsafe, they would automatically call the sheriffs. And so when I first got to the court, I'm like, no, this can happen. And so I was able to train my staff in mental health first aid, so it's a program to teach the community how to recognize signs or symptoms of someone and, experiencing a mental health problem or a crisis. And so, and also train them in trauma informed, principles. And so I removed that panic button, people come through the metal detector. So it's not necessarily that they're coming in with weapons, but our approach to people can either escalate or de-escalate, and calling the police every time is just inappropriate. And it was just about educating them. It was about just giving them information and a different perspective. Although someone may be presenting, in a psychic episode, they still have awareness. They're still people. They're still worthy of their dignity and worth. And we have to honor that, And so if you're afraid to talk to them, call me and I will come. And so for a while, they would call me. But after they were trained in mental health first aid, you could see just that level of engagement, just honored, those individuals. And that was so very important to me. And it was like, no, we're not calling the police, no, and so sometimes we had to, but that should not have been, what happened first. Let's kind of triage and see what we can do. And if it kind of escalates, that we have to kind of involve someone, or if I'm not there, but that should not be what happens to someone who is experiencing a mental health problem. And so I love the fact that when I left there, I could hear a clerk, really kind of engaging someone. And when they felt it was outside of their lane, they would call me or one of the other social workers for the court. And so I was really, really proud of that, for them to kind of understand, yeah, that is just not how we treat people, and again, it just is about raising awareness, and giving people information. And when you know better, you do better. But that was just important to me because you have, these marginalized individuals who don't trust systems anyway. And if they make a trip to the court, and if they perhaps had, some things that they were dealing with, we're not going to call the police, we're going to try to engage with them.
And I think we've seen, just like in the media, so many examples of times when, law enforcement was called to like manage a mental health issue and it ended with not a good outcome. So I think that is amazing that even the court, they must be very progressive, because the fact they were open to even getting like mental health first aid just to me speaks a lot about your presence. And also that system, because some people aren't even open to it. They're like, no, we're here to enforce law. That's our job. We're not going to be open to that part. So kudos to you for that, because that like is literally life-saving. That can really like save lives doing that. What about in, and I know we're just right about the end of our time, but Shanique, I do want to hear just a little bit about like your kind of county and state, like those systems, like challenges there, and like how you kind of navigated some of that.
So access is always just, we have this huge need, and the pandemic really just kind of revealed just there were gaps in services and just not enough providers. And so one of the grants that I oversee is a disaster response grant. And so in 2019, our county and a couple of surrounding counties had F4 tornadoes come through and like literally just wreak havoc and destruction. And, there's still spaces still trying to recover from that. We also had a mass shooting, not too many months after the tornado. And so the board that I work for applied for this federal grant. And so we are pouring services into the schools. We are giving therapists the options to become certified in treatment modalities, whether it's EMDR or trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy. We're also just putting crisis support in schools. There's a student resilience counselor in schools that kind of help those students. And so the goal is to reach unduplicated individuals. So those who have slipped through the cracks, we're targeting those individuals purposefully. So we have adult services, we have youth services. We are addressing the trauma of the community, so there are different coalitions, just to try to bridge the gap, to kind of make sure where there are the gaps in services, there are, healing opportunities, for community members. And so that's been kind of cool to see communities come together to support, after the traumas that Montgomery County experienced. So I don't know if that answered your question, but
Yeah, no, it's great. It's like so good to hear like all of the great things that are happening, because so often I feel like mental health, we just kind of fall by the wayside, or we're like an afterthought. So to me, anytime that we're the importance of it is being shown. And I think, again, like I'm saying, particularly from the social work perspective, because as we've heard on this live, y'all have so much like wide and varied experiences and perspectives that I think is one that that needs to be heard. So we're at the end of our time. So I don't know if there's any like closing thoughts, or for anyone who's watching, if they're interested in social work, if you guys have any final thoughts, and then we'll wrap up.
I'll just say, to close out, social work is again, it's a diverse career. It's a rewarding one. Your life's work is devoted to really caring for those in need. And so, I obviously am an advocate for anyone who's interested in this field. And there are so many different things you can do with this type of experience and background that, I think we'll see that the sky is the limit as we go on and see more and more changes. And I think we'll see social work in so many other different avenues. So thank you for the opportunity to kind of put this on display. I'm sure we're all very proud of what we do every day, and, love any opportunity we can to kind of spread the word about social work.
Yeah, I would agree. Social work is the bomb. I love it. I've wanted, I don't know, ever since I stepped into my first social work class, like I knew that was where I wanted to be. I just love working with other humans and being like a positive person in like somebody's life, and trying to, support people, especially who are marginalized, I think. So I'm just grateful to be a part and amongst you three beautiful not Dr. Dooley, but and women of color. And I just think it's incredible. And I just love, I feel honored to be a part of this chat, because I do feel like a baby therapist. But so yeah, thank you. And if people didn't know, Leanne's my stepmom. So
Julie is she's a social work ally. So we'll
she is. She supports me, and so thank you, Leanne, for inviting me.
You're welcome. Thank you for being here.
I would say to any social work student or new social worker, like shadow individuals, interview them, and don't necessarily be so set on, kind of a setting. Be open, pursue internships that may be diverse or different from what you had thought, because sometimes you may find your mission and your purpose in unsuspecting places, and so just really do your research on the front end. All of us will be available, and we'll love the opportunity to talk to you, but talk to people in the field, ask questions, not just the warm, fuzzy questions, but ask the difficult questions. What do you wish someone would have asked you or told you about your particular line of work? What's a difficult day like for you? What do you hate about your job? We always ask, what do you love? Those sorts of questions. But to be informed, I think that kind of gives you staying power, in this field. Just really engage with diverse people in the field to kind of get a perspective and perhaps a new interest that you maybe didn't consider at first or at all.
Thank you for that. And I want to say again, happy Social Work Month. I, appreciate social work. Like Lula said, I'm an ally and I'm always an advocate for social work. And I hope, we have a lot of strings that came up here that we didn't have time to get into. Shanika, I feel like the legal system and mental health in general is a whole live stream that we can have maybe at some point in the future. But just thank you, ladies, again. And I'm looking forward to the next time we can all talk again.
Thank you.
Thank you.